Hi, it's Truth Seeker again. A couple things crossed my mind that I didn't think of when I was providing that little history on Malcolm Rutherford um, and the Rutherford family and their dysfunction as a family. One thing that crossed my mind was that my family immigrated from Scotland in 1909, the very year that Watchtower moved from Allegheny, or Pittsburgh today, Pennsylvania, to Brooklyn, New York, and set up shop there. No doubt Judge Rutherford was a big part of that move and moved to Brooklyn with his family, along with the rest of the Bethel, or at the time it was Bible House family. I guess they changed the name to Bethel when they got to Brooklyn, so that was the first use of Bethel family, was when they established the Bethel home in Brooklyn. Now, my grandmother, she mentioned that when they came to the United States, they contacted, their first contact with the Bible students was the purser of the ship, which was the SS Columbia, that they sailed from Glasgow to New York. And they must have come through Ellis Island. That was the protocol back in those days. And they settled in Brooklyn. Now, the purser of the ship, of the Columbia, was a Bible student. And they befriended him, and my great-grandparents befriended him. And he told them and witnessed to them about the Bible students. And I'm sure he recommended that they contact the Bible students in Brooklyn. Well, my great-grandparents did end up settling in Brooklyn. I have checked ancestry records for my great-grandparents, and I found some very interesting things about family in Scotland that I didn't know. So that was one outcome of my ancestry search. But it came to my mind that that my great-grandparents and my grandmother and her family, she had a younger brother, and in 1920 her youngest sister was born. They took the same train as the Bethel family, to meeting on Sunday to the New York Temple. Now, the New York Temple was the meeting place for Bible students in the early 20th century. It was also where the photodrama of creation was first debuted. It was also the place where Russell's funeral was held when Russell died in 1916. And my grandmother recounted, especially in her later years, over and over again, their experience of taking the train from Brooklyn to New York, or Manhattan Island, to the New York Temple. Now, I didn't think of this before, but my grandmother was substantially younger than Malcolm. By 1909, Malcolm would have been 17 years old. He would have been in high school and attending New York public school system. But my grandmother would have been about 6 years old. She was roughly 9 or 10 years younger than Malcolm. And so it's quite possible that my grandmother and Malcolm knew each other. Now, whether or not they spent any meaningful time, or whether or not he was thought of her as a friend, she was so much younger than him that he may not have shown any interest as a teenager towards her. But it's possible. But I'm certain they met, and I'm certain they talked. And by the time she was old enough to be interviewed by Russell in roughly around 1914, Malcolm was still living in at the Bethel, because there's a manifest, a ship's registry, showing that Joseph, Mary, and Malcolm had taken the Mauritania to, I believe the manifest was from London to New York. It was a November, but I know it was a November manifest. It was a ship's registry, but I don't recall if it was going or coming back. I'd have to check that again, but I can pull it up on Ancestry. But in 1914, Malcolm would have been 22, and my grandmother would have been about maybe 12 years old. So they could have had an intelligible conversation, although she was far too young for him to ever show any kind of interest beyond being a polite young man and talking to a younger girl. But it never crossed my mind before that they may have met. But I'm certain of it. I'm absolutely certain of it. They were meeting at the same meeting hall for years. They took the same train to and from meeting for years. It just kind of blew my mind when I thought about that they may have known each other. And I could have made a segue in with him if I ever met him, if I had ever known him. He lived. I was 34 years old in 1985. I was 35, so I was almost 40. No, let's see, 55 to 85. I was 30. I was 34 years old when he died. And if I had ever been, I was in California in 1987. If I had known anything about him, I think it would have been fascinating to try and make contact, because I'm so drawn by history. And if I had known that this man existed, then I wasn't even aware of this until I did some research into the Bible student's history within the last decade or so. So I didn't know him in 1987. I didn't know of him in 1987, but it would have been fascinating. And if I had known something about him before that, I would have asked my grandmother, even though she was becoming senile when I was a young man. She would, many of her early memories were still intact, and I could have asked her about him and what he was like, but that opportunity's gone. Oh, and one more interesting thing. Now, it's many days, and back in those days, there was a strong sense of family. People named their children after family members very often. For example, my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, her maiden name was Southard. And so my grandfather was Felix Southard Wassman. So his middle name was his mother's maiden name. My brother, in honor of my grandmother, great-grandmother, and my grandfather, was George Southard Yike. And so the Southard name lived on as middle names. Now, Malcolm's middle name was Cameron. Malcolm Cameron Rutherford. And I suspect that it's likely that they were related some way to somebody with the last name Cameron. Now, my great-grandmother from Scotland, her maiden name was Helen Cameron McCubry. And my grandmother was named Annie after her grandmother. And but the name Cameron was prevalent in my great-grandmother's family. Many of her siblings their middle name was Cameron. And I learned that through Ancestry just the other day. Now, Cameron was a clan in Scotland, one of the biggest clans, Clan Cameron. And they're very proud. And I am partly derived from Clan Cameron. I'm wondering about Malcolm Cameron Rutherford. There may have been a Cameron connection, and my grandmother would not have been lost on my great-grandmother. If she had known Malcolm Cameron Rutherford, there's no doubt in my mind that my great-grandmother, being as proud as she was about her Scottish heritage, that she would have made mention of the Cameron name to Malcolm. So I think that there is some connection there. It's just supposition at this point, but I believe it's reasonable supposition. And I just wish, knowing what I know now, that I had one opportunity to ask those questions. But that's time. That's history. And everything's lost, except to our imagination and what few records that may exist. So anyway, that's just an addendum to my previous. What about Malcolm? I feel bad for that guy. I kind of understand what it might have been like for him, what life might have been like for him. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker saying, have a good weekend.